Hey, what's new and exciting? Tim Werner here. This episode is called Programmers or Rock Stars. And the bottom line is I tend to fanboy over people who are really skilled at software development. My own hobby is in game design and game development. That's one of my special interests. Now, I don't have that facility with programming. It's, frankly, a secret wish of mine that eventually I'll be proficient enough in programming to where I feel I'm somewhere in the vicinity of fluency with programming as I am with the English language speaking and writing. Because that's how, in my mind, when I think of rock star programmers, these are people who think algorithmically to the point where they don't even need to be seated at their computer to do development work. Let me give you two examples that I've been meditating on a lot recently. One, to go back into game design, I think of David Crane, who is the old Activision programmer who made Pitfall and a whole bunch of other legendary Atari 2600 games. If you go to YouTube, you can watch and listen to Dave's lectures on Atari 2600 and the story of Activision. I've just been eating up all that history, and it's been a special interest of mine my whole life. But there's a story that Dave Crane and a woman named Carol Shaw, who's also a brilliant programmer. She made Activision's River Raid. You might be familiar with that one. The story goes that at Activision, the developers worked in a communal room. And when you'd walk into the room, if a dev was hunched over their workstation, it was implied that you don't interrupt them because they're in the zone. But when the programmer would push back their chair from their desk, then it was open season. And not only would you interact with each other, but they would play test and critique each other's games, ask for advice, that kind of stuff. And the way this story goes is Carol Shaw was working on River Raid, and she needed a sound clip for when your ship is running low on gas or low on fuel. And the Atari 2600, due to the way the circuit board was developed, it was not made for good audio. In fact, it couldn't even produce standard pitches. Hence the reason why audio on Atari 2600 sounds so wonky. So she mentioned this to the group. She said, look, I'm stuck. I need an audio clip for low fuel. And Dave Crane turned around, looked at her, and he started spouting off 6502 assembly mnemonics just off the top of his head. Carol grabbed a pen and paper and just as furiously transcribing. Dave's like, do this, blah, 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 blah. So Carol wrote it down, typed it in, and it was perfect. It was the perfect audio that she needed for the game. I love that story. This guy, David Crane, you should check him out if you're not familiar with him. I mean, he's programmed for pretty much every game console ever made. And his ability to think like a programmer is so innate. It's like the air that he breathes. I'm flabbergasted. A more current story and more personal to me, my friend Don Jones, who now has moved really into business and management, but for a number of years, he was in the Microsoft technical community, specifically in PowerShell. He and my friend Jeff Hicks wrote really the foundational book on learning PowerShell, to the point where I think to this day, the PowerShell engineering team at Microsoft hands out Learn PowerShell in a month of lunches to new hires as a way for them to immediately get proficient with the language. Well, anyway, I don't remember which book or books it was, but Don was telling me once that for one of his books, he and his partner were going a long ways away on vacation, and he wound up in a situation where I don't even think he had a computer. He had no ability to write and test PowerShell at any rate. But meanwhile, he's working on a book, and he felt inspired, and he wrote the lion's share of the book. I don't remember if he wrote it longhand or if he just happened to be on a computer that he didn't have access to PowerShell. It was something like that. But the bottom line is he wrote pretty much the whole book just with his mind. And I think it was a book on PowerShell scripting. So it's not just knowing commands and syntax, it's actual full data structures and everything else. And he did all this longhand. And then when he got back to civilization, I don't know if he tested his code or he just submitted it to Manning, which is his publisher or was his publisher, and they tested it. But all the code checked out perfectly, even better than how it would have been if he were at a computer working with the PowerShell live as he typed it. That again is an example of somebody who has such native facility with programming and that way of thinking that it's like the proverbial air they breathe. It amazes me. And you can take that kind of extreme aptitude and apply it to just about any field of endeavor. I feel to a lesser degree, but I do feel like a fanboy with people who have strong facility with auto mechanics and engine mechanics, people who can look at a car and diagnose what's wrong with it just by listening to the engine for a few minutes. I find that amazing. I'd like to think that everybody has a superpower or two along some lines, and I guess I can turn that around into a lesson. Because in previous YouTube videos, I've talked about my 3-step recipe for finding your professional passion. That is the junction of your native abilities. That's what proficiency. That's what I'm talking about now in this video. But then combining that with your genuine interest in it, and then putting in the time to hone your skills. And certainly I've known people who have profound abilities, but because they don't have interest. My sister-in-law, Michelle, is like that, actually. She's got native musical ability to where she can hear a tune and immediately replicate it on the piano or the saxophone. But I don't think Shell has a lot of interest in it because she doesn't invest any time in it. You see what I mean? That's why I strongly believe you need those 3 interdependent pillars to master a craft and to hone your professional passion. I do claim some of that facility with music for myself. And people have expressed, being impressed with my musical talent. And I'm grateful for that. I don't think it's a question of braggadocio or ego to recognize, yes, I do have proficiency. I have native proficiency with music. I have native proficiency with teaching and with instructional design. And this is it's really humility because it's accepting the facts as they are. For example, my 13-year-old daughter yesterday sent me a text message saying, "What do you think of the chord progression C major, C minor, G, E?" She's been tinkering around with the baritone ukulele, and she's like, "I really like the way that sounds." And I was inspired. I grabbed my guitar and came up with a quick song with that chord progression. And she was blown away, and I said, "Well, thank you. It's just natural. It's like the air I breathe." I can also listen to a tune once and be able to identify its structure. I guess that's just one of those things. There's got to be, I think, a genetics aspect to this, to having native proficiency. Now, what's strange in my case is that I can't think of any real big musicians in my family. In other words, people in my extended family tree for whom music was a big deal. I mean, certainly from a listener's perspective, my dad was a big influence because he's always been a music guy, but I've never heard my dad make a single note of music on any instrument or sing or anything like that. I don't know. Must have just been lurking in my genetic family tree. In the environmental aspect, I think I would largely credit with my dad because I've been surrounded by music all my life. Yeah, so I hope that makes some semblance of sense. I can't think of anything else to say, and I'm actually tempted to pad out this video to 10 minutes for OCD purposes because I like to make these video clips 10 minutes long. But I don't pad. It's always going to be legit content. So how can we use this final minute together productively? I guess my willingness to do that is a demonstration of my facility as an instructor. I think what I'll do is post a YouTube video in the future as an ode or a fanboy appreciation to technical trainers. Because I'm telling you, when you meet a seasoned technical trainer, somebody who's accustomed to standing up in front of a group and delivering content, you're talking to a real professional because you have to think on your feet. In some ways, it's a similar skill set to an improvisational comedian because as a tech trainer, you're seeing everything all the time. You're seeing and resolving tech issues, not only with your own stack, but with the audience. You've got audience members of various skill levels that you're juggling. You're having environmental hurdles to overcome. Oops, I lost 20 minutes because there was a fire drill. And that ability for the tech trainer to think on their feet and learn quickly is super duper valuable. And I think I'd like to dive into that more in a future lesson. But anyway, huge fan of programmers. Thank you for what you do if you're a programmer, and I'll see you next time.